book of James. We're actually going to cover in some fashion, I think, all the verses of James. Of course, if you were preaching it, you might not do it in 13 sessions. You might do it in 130. I don't know. We'll talk about those kind of things briefly along the way. But we have 13 sessions that cover the paragraphs or the sections of James. We also have this year 4 application or testimony sections that are follow-ups. So, one of the themes of James, one of the ideas of James is dealing with difficulty, dealing with trials and suffering. And so we have some testimonies lined up that follow that and hopefully we want to make it very practical. James is a practical book. And so we want to actually practice the practical by doing that. And we have one of them tonight at one of the last sessions tonight. So 4 of those. We have 6. I'm kind of excited about these. There's 6 that I'm calling church or ministry track. And by track, I don't mean a separate thing, but there's a sub-theme here of some ministry issues. A couple panels and a couple discussion points and so on. And so 6 of those. And then finally, there are 3, I think, wrap-up or summary sessions. Some issues with theology, big picture, and including as is the closing message. So that's where we're headed. You'll see that format. That's what we're trying to do. And the exegetical ones make the framework for that. So we are here in James, and this is the official start of the first session. We probably ought to have a word of prayer. All right, so this session is the introductory session. It is one of the exegetical ones, though I'm not doing full exegesis, but we're beginning to lay the groundwork. This is more of a interactive walkthrough of introductory materials, and so you probably already have your Bibles open. That'll be useful. And I have worked through James a couple of times. The last one was about a year ago. I feel like I have a handle on some of it, but I actually have some questions. I usually end up with some questions. I'll probably present some of them even in this session. And but I want your interaction. One of the big ones, the background here is important in a couple of ways. So background is kind of author, date, audience. Then we get into some observations that will lay groundwork for exegesis or that come out of exegesis, so features, key terms. And of course, in some ways we're working towards the theme. And I would still admit the theme in our brochure is joy in the trials of life. I think the last time I preached it, I used the theme of proven character through testing, something like that. And but we'll get to that one. That's one that takes a little bit of work, I think. So there's some interaction there, and then the structure in the organization. So there's some practical things, a lot of issues, and so I'm looking for some of your observations. I'll get us going here. Let me start with the author issue. James, of course, as the attributed one. Really the name Jacob, but we call him James. So which James is this going to be? Which James is this going to be? And the first 2 or 3 on there, author, audience, and so on, some of the features are going to play into the date of writing. I think there are 3 or 4 James that are in Scripture. I'm not getting much feedback. We got James the Apostle, all right? We're going with brother of Jesus, all right? James the Apostle is going to have difficulty because he kind of lost his head over things, and so he's unable to write. But we have James the brother of Jesus, all right? And one of the terms that would go with that, and of course this isn't in the book itself, in the book, the epistle, we might call him the half-brother of Jesus to be technical. The word I came across, I think the technical terminology, at least I came across in 1 or 2 places, is that he is considered the uterine brother of Jesus. So same mother, but not the same father. All right. So, but it is James. It appears to be James, the half-brother or uterine brother of Jesus, which is interesting because in the opening verse here, he does not lay claim to that, does he? It says James, the slave of God, James, the servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. So we have this one. He is prominent Interestingly, because he becomes the main pastor, the lead pastor, if you will, in our nomenclature, of the Jerusalem church fairly early on. Peter seems to be part of the founding, and then it turns over very quickly to this James. All right, so we have that. It's not the apostle. There's a couple of Jameses mentioned, but we think it's James, the half-brother, or the uterine brother of Jesus. The audience is listed here as the 12 tribes in the dispersion. 12 tribes in the dispersion, all right? So from your work, which dispersion are we talking about? It might be all the same one, but it's in stages. But what's the background of the dispersion? Well, we take the original dispersion back to the northern tribe of Israel, back in the Old Testament. There's a second one, was it 586, I think, when Jerusalem fell, and then that's the southern kingdom of Judah. I'm not convinced that's exactly the one he's talking about, all right? Now, there's another mention in the New Testament of the dispersion that's resulting from that. Do you recall where that is located? Description of the dispersion. Acts, I think it's chapter 2, it might be relisted somewhere else. I think it's in Acts chapter 2, so it probably includes that. Probably includes that, if you want to look there for just a second. And then I think the Acts 8 one is where I was headed in a moment. What we have in 2 is a listing of all these countries, Jews from these different locales, and so that might be part of it. And you recall that on the day of Pentecost, all those different locations and so on. And then the one you're referring to, I think, is narrowing it in. In chapter 8, following the death of Stephen, we have in verses 1 and 2, I think it is, the church is scattered. The church is scattered. And that probably is the more specific dispersion that we're talking about. All right, that's going to tie in with the audience. The audience is Jewish. This is the 12 tribes in the dispersion. And we're headed towards when was this written? Because I think this is sort of interesting. It's actually somewhat important in the discussion, particularly when we get into theology. Well, how do we know that it's Jewish? It's one of the most Jewish books in the New Testament. Well, one of the issues is in chapter 2, I think it's verses 1 or 2, when someone comes into your assembly, it's really the word synagogue. The word church, ecclesia, is not found in the text here. And so this is one of the reasons that it seems to be very early. The terminology, the wording, the vocabulary, the topics are very Jewish. It seems to be Jewish readers, seems to be Jewish hearers that would be receiving this instruction from James. And so that does go to the Acts 8, verse 1 and 2 there, the dispersion. The church was scattered other than the apostles. And it would be my contention that it is that audience, however far they got scattered, that is the recipients of this epistle. And that would imply a couple things. One is the reason a lot of the reason the Gentiles are not mentioned there in James, we don't really find mention of Gentiles nor of Gentile issues, is because I think this is early enough that there's no real Gentile contingent in the church. So this is, now in terms of a timeline, because we're really headed towards questions of when this is written, we want to figure out if there are no Gentiles around, when did this book get written? So we'll get to that in a second. One other thing is actually, and I've not done a lot of work, I've just come across some who've done some, is that the writing here of James, he probably quotes is the wrong word. He refers to or alludes to, he references Jesus' teaching but it's not the exact forms that are found in, say, Matthew, Mark, or Luke. It appears to be the oral form that James himself would have heard, and others would have heard as well. In other words, what I'm beginning to build a case for is that James is written before the Gospels. You know, the Gospels come in a little bit later. He can't quote Mark because Mark isn't written. And so it's probably the oral forms. I mean, we recognize the teaching. There's quite a bit out of the Sermon on the Mount, and there are things we recognize as statements of Jesus from the Gospels, but the wording is just a little bit different. And so that is the conjecture. I think it's probably pretty solid that he himself had heard Jesus teach. And he was among people, the disciples and others, who had heard Jesus teach. And this oral tradition was passed down, and it's from those that he would quote these sayings that end up in the epistle, all right? So what's that going to do? He addresses them as my brothers. That's part of the audience. And this will, you know, I think it's more than Jewish. I think this is my Christian brothers. And that's going to tip my hand on some things on the whole book. We'll get to that momentarily. But that becomes a pretty big issue on to whom James is writing. Who are these people he's addressing? And so that's some things there. Other contribution, other observations you have on this audience that you have come across in your reading of James or in your studies of other materials? Yeah.
I found it interesting. Acts 1:8, Jesus says, "You're going to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and so on." You go through the first part of Acts, you're just sitting there in Jerusalem. So the Lord had used the dispersion to get them to do what the Lord commanded them to do.
Yes. All right. Good observation. The gospel begins to move outward in that ring. Yeah, that ring. All right. So date. I've already hinted that it's a fairly early book. What are some of the clues or what are some of the factors that are included in our dating? We've already given some of them. It appears to be pre-Gentile inclusion of the church. There are no Gentile issues, so it doesn't, just doesn't write about those things that we see in Paul. What are some other factors? And we're trying to get towards a date. Now, let me frame the question a little bit better. Out of the book of Acts, what are some timelines? I mean, we understand that we have from around 30 or 33 A.D. is death of Christ, right? And we got 100 A.D., give or take, death of John, Revelation. We got to get the book inside there somewhere. What nobody holds is written before Jesus died, nor after John, so it's somewhere in there. What other dates do we have? Destruction of the temple. All right, year for that is 70 A.D. All right, 70 A.D. So we've slid this part down. We've backed it up a little bit. That gives us, it appears to be written before then, at least. Why? I mean, it's a little bit inconclusive, but why? James does not mention the temple at all. It's just not there. He doesn't mention the destruction. It's not there, all right? So 70 A.D., we're between about 30 and 70. What else? What's another one? Yeah.
We've already mentioned it probably has to be after 8-1, after that dispersion.
Okay, after 8-1. And I haven't tracked down an exact date for that. Has anyone got a date? It's probably in the 30s, early 30s, something like that. Something like that, all right? So we're squishing it in here a little bit. One other date that would be important if you're aware of that one. I'm going to suggest this is before Acts 15 in the council, all right? In fact, I suspect it may be before Acts 13 and Paul and, was it Barnabas early, that went out. That's the entrance of the Gentiles into the church. So what kind of dates are we getting? The Jerusalem Council, my understanding is about 49. I think that's the outside of the dating of this book. 49, all right? The dates that I have seen, I just described this for you, very Jewish in character. On the late side would be 45 to 49. On the early side, and this is what I personally lean towards, but I mean, it's not a test of fellowship, but is a pretty early date in the mid-30s. What does this do in relation to the New Testament writings for James? It's probably the earliest book. I think even the later date, the only one's going to compete is Galatians. Isn't that usually 49 or 50 AD, somewhere in there?
Well, could you use the end of chapter 1, circumstantial evidence, but the amount of widows and orphans still relative to the initial dispersion from like Acts 6, you have the issue of widows.
Potentially. I hadn't thought of that. If you didn't hear Ralph, the end of chapter 1, you have an emphasis on visiting the widows and the orphans. And if that's connected with the dispersion, if that's what you're talking about, the persecution that went with that, that's a possibility. It would be a factor potentially. That'd be a thought. I hadn't thought of it.
The later you go, the less that would have been an issue.
Probably. I mean, we have Pauline literature that deals with widows, but it's a possibility. I hadn't thought of it. That would be a possibility. Those are the kinds of things we're looking for. That's the kind of input I'm looking for tonight, things you've come across. So anyways, this becomes significant in reference to it may well be. I'm kind of thinking, I mean, Galatians, I don't remember the date for Mark. What's the early date for Mark? That's one of the early ones. Does anyone remember? This is going to be pretty early. This may well be the first one. And if we're on the right track here, if what I'm suggesting is correct, it was written to the church, and that's going to begin to deal some theology references here now, but written to the church that is entirely or nearly entirely, enough entirely Jewish, that he writes it to the 12 tribes dispersed, probably out of Acts 8, and he calls them my brothers. Now, where this is going to head, I'll introduce it, and throughout the conference here, we're going to be developing this, I think, from different speakers and different ideas. One of the issues is going to come up, and I have the delight of being the speaker for one of the hard passages in chapter 2, the faith without works passage. Sometime tomorrow, we'll look at that. But the theological question is, if these are Christians, if my brothers is Christians, they're Jewish, but if they are born-again Christians, and that is consistent throughout the epistle, and by the way, that's essentially the case I am making. That's what I want to make. There may be other speakers who approach it slightly differently. I'm guessing most of us are on pretty close to the same page. You understand that one of the big theological issues that is alive and kicking today has to do with, in this area of lordship salvation, or what is often called free grace salvation, free grace theology. What's going on here, the faith without works kind of stuff. And one of the instructive ideas, one of the importances of the early date, is that James was not arguing with Paul in this book about we're justified by faith or we're justified by works or whatever it is, because Paul had not yet written. James is addressing what is there for him, which is a practical living out of the faith of those who are born again. And so, that's an introduction. We'll come back around to that more than once in this study. But that's the significance, I think, one of the significances of the dating of James. And so I'm pushing for before the council, at least 45, 49. I kind of think into the 30s. I think it's pretty early. I think this is a pretty early book. So let's move on. Again, you can stop me if you have questions. What are some features? What are some, as you have studied, preached, worked through, done Bible studies, whatever, out of James, what are some features and characteristics that are interesting, that are pertinent for studying, for looking at the Epistle of James? What kind of things have you seen, the patterns or style of writing or those kind of things? Practical, all right? It's considered very practical, all right? Did I see another hand back there? Yeah.
I see him making contrast constantly between
Yeah. Yeah, okay. As a side note, what other Bible book does that remind you of? Proverbs, all right? And that's one of the things I have on my list. You would probably come across this. This is sometimes considered the Proverbs or the wisdom literature of the New Testament, the Proverbs of the New Testament. I think that may be a little overdone. I think Proverbs is much pithier. It's much more proverbial in strict form. But the concepts are there, and certainly the contrast. We see that quite often. He builds cases, this or that. What else do you see in there? What other observations? Yeah.
I think he's quite direct. He doesn't seem to be a punch bowl.
Okay, pretty direct, all right, all right. I didn't have that one down. I think I could go with that. I think that would be pretty good.
Does he use the X? Like if anyone lacks wisdom,
Mm-hmm.
does he use that more than other authors, or is that?
I don't know, does anyone know? I haven't done a comparison study on percentage usage or anything. Rich's question is, does James use the conditional if, more frequently than others? I don't know the answer to that.
I would say Apostle Paul uses it a lot, example,
Mhm.
what if Christ had not died, 1 Corinthians 15.
Okay. All right. Paul uses it. I'm not, off the top of my head, I'm not sure he uses it more, but he does use it. It seems to be, and I would say, we'll get there in a minute on kind of analyzing the big structure. My initial observation is he uses that for subpoints, not for major divisions. All right. You can keep giving them. Let me give you a few that I have come across. Consider New Testament wisdom literature. It's practical. He's very concerned with doing. And so here's another. It is sometimes said it's not really theological. You notice I put question marks. I actually think it is quite theological. And the wording you might use is that his theology is more implicit than explicitly stated. In other words, he's going to develop a theology of Christian living in which the way you do it is you live it out. And if you're not living it out, then there's problems. And that, of course, that's where we get into the theological questions on our end. What does that mean? And we'll pursue that along the way, a little bit in this introduction and further along. But the theology is more implicit. Along with that, some have noticed that the name of Christ is not found here very much, which is sort of true and sort of not. I think he's mentioned by name twice or three times in the text, Lord, Jesus Christ in verse 1. But the text very much centers on pointing to Christ, pointing to living for him, pointing to a faith that is alive in Christ, and so on, and his sovereign control, and so on. So there's the theology is more woven into the Proverbs, if that's what we're going to call it, into the style that he's writing, than say Paul. Paul tends to be he is also epistolatory, writes epistles. But Paul's tends to be, in my opinion, more, usually the starting chapters tend to be borderline legal. It's a little more, I think it's his legal mind that's developing cases of theology about Christology or salvation or whatever it might be. And James is more just, sort of just preaching. He's just telling, this is almost like a sermon, and the theology is woven into it pretty well. One of the comments is that it lacks structure or organization. It's kind of random. And that would fit into if we overdid a comparison to the book of Proverbs. Proverbs, at least parts of it, do seem to be kind of random, right? You hit one topic, hit another topic, come back to the first one, move on to a fifth topic, whatever. I'm going to suggest, this is what we're going to spend a little bit of time on here in a minute, is looking for the structure, and I imagine you guys have spotted some stuff. This is the kind of stuff, especially if you're some of the younger preachers, we want to encourage you to learn to do this. But the fact that it lacks structure organization, I'm not sure that's true. I don't think it is. Some of my questions still have to do with how to organize it, but I think we're going to spot some things that will help us with that a little bit. And by the way, some of this comes out of that concept that is very random comes out of some of the much earlier theologians. If you remember Martin Luther, James was not his favorite Bible book. Does anyone remember the quote about James? Do you remember it, Justin? Or? Yeah, a right strawy epistle. He didn't like it because I'm sure in context where he had come to the just shall live by faith, we're justified by faith, and here is James saying something different, and so he didn't like it. And then there was another German theologian, Martin Dibelius, I think is his name, back 150 years ago or so, 200 years ago, who made that kind of comment that it's a very disorganized book. It's just kind of random hortatories, it's random exhortations. And so we want to dispel that and work on it a little bit here, give you some things, some tips, and I want to hear if you have come across some things along with that. Another feature characters I've noticed, others have too, is, and I forget the technical name, I'm calling them vocabulary chains or hooks. And by that is meant that one statement, one phrase, one verse will end with a particular word, and the next phrase or verse will pick up with that word. And I think he does it several times throughout the book. The first few verses is a good one. So in verse 2 you have, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. I'm reading ESV here tonight. So it ends with steadfastness. The next verse picks up with steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. All right. So there's a unit of thought. That does seem to be a full thought unit. And the next thought unit picks up with what? If any of you does lack something. And so if you finish this cycle, you'll be mature and lack nothing. And it says, but if you do lack something, you can ask for wisdom. And so there's these hooks or chains where they're connected in that way. I think you'll discover some more throughout the book like that. A big one, who mentioned the contrast? Was that Dan? A play on words, some contrasts. And so, it does sound wisdom literature kind of thing, sounds proverbial. I picked this one example. There's a play on words. I think Alan's covering some of this later tonight. I don't know all what he's going to cover, but this section. But in verses 14 and 15, you have a process of temptation happening, and when we give in to temptation, it actually, the wording is almost, it gives birth to death. It's kind of a strange, contrasting wording, but the contrast continues on. There's a birth to death. 14, 15, each person is tempted when he's lured and enticed by his own desire, then desire when it has conceived. It's kind of, there's a conception, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. And so there's this chain again, but the contrast continues. Don't be deceived, beloved brothers. Every good gift, every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. And he's just discussed sin giving birth to death, the kind of thing. And in verse 18 he says, of his own will, speaking of the Father, he brought us forth. He birthed us by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. And so there's, again, these contrasts or plays on words that James develops throughout the book. And that's just one example. I think if you look, you'll find some more. Another one are connections later in the book. And so by that I mean themes that are started in one place and keep recurring or keep coming back. So give me some of those. I'll start you. The concept of trials in verse 2, chapter 1, verse 2. When you encounter trials of various kinds, the testing of your faith, that concept of being in trials, and that's why some of the writers considered facing trials to be the theme, and it may well be that it's part of the theme, but anyways, the concept of trials and tests keeps recurring in different forms. And so you have it down later in verse 12, blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. It comes back up. And it's going to reoccur throughout the book several times in different forms, including in illustrations. And so, for instance, the passage I'll be working on tomorrow in chapter 2, verses 14 to 26, one of the well-known, what's it profit if you have faith and no works, and so on. James is going to bring in there Abraham and the sacrifice of Isaac. And I'll highlight this tomorrow, but that is a primo. I think that's probably the prototypical illustration of a test. And indeed, it's not just me making it up. If you remember in Genesis 22, after these things, the Lord tested Abraham. We're told that's what it is. And so these kind of things that reoccur. What other reoccurring connections, what other recurring themes do you find there? The tongue, all right? Speech comes in there, the tongue. And again, sometimes it's not the exact word. It can be tongue and speech. Did you have one?
Verse 22, the hearers versus the doers, hearing and doing.
Okay, that's a major thing, yeah. Not just hearing, but doing. And doing becomes a big thing. That the faith is to be carried out, the word is to be received and done, all right? What else?
That it may become perfect, it's mentioned in 1:4, it's mentioned again in chapter 3.
Yeah, perfection or maturity, I think it's found 3 or 4 times throughout there.
The trials actually turn into becoming the church in chapter 4. The trials, how they're fighting amongst themselves.
Yeah, all right, there's things going on there. All right. So these would be some of the things we would be looking for. I don't know that list anymore. So let's talk about theme. What do we have? Our, the brochure is not an inspired text. It's just the brochure. We had there the joy and the trials of life. I don't know that captures the whole. You have a date for getting the printing out, and it's got to go. I don't know that it misses it entirely, but it certainly captures a big idea in James, and that is that we ought to come to a place where we are able to and do rejoice in the midst of trials. I'd mentioned another one that I had come across, proven character through trials. So again, trials is in those two. That one tends to emphasize that not only joy, I suppose, but living out the Christian faith and allowing the trials to develop our faith in persevering and maturing ways. But what else have you guys come up with for a theme? This is one of the goals of our introductory study, and this is one I'm saying. I've used a couple when I preach through, but I haven't been fully satisfied. It's like getting a slogan, right? It's hard to get it just right. Yeah.
The word brothers or brethren is in there about 18 times. So I thought a letter to my brothers.
Letter to my brother, okay. All right. I'm not sure that's a great theme, but you're actually a step ahead of the rest of the class because that's going to be one of the organizational features we're going to look at. So you're on the right track. Those are the kind of observations. Thematically, maybe, but I think it's more than just, and I'm not trying to correct, but the title, A Letter to My Brothers, doesn't tell us much. So I think for a theme, we're looking for something that's getting done, that we're being challenged to do. Ralph?
So one of the things I have to do often is try to talk somebody into learning how to live righteously no matter what their circumstances. And I see that James, and I use James a lot.
James would fit there, yeah.
If in fact he's writing to the dispersion, now this is not a voluntary migration. So these are people that have been put out, they may not even be wanted where they are, but they've got to live righteously. And so
Yeah.
I see that as part of.
That'd be interesting, yeah, because a lot of times when we are under duress, when we're in tests, we didn't choose to be there, right? And that's, I think, partly what you're saying. When you're applying it to someone, they might be in trouble, they might be in trial due to forced circumstances. And that's found in the text, too. It appears that in the dispersion, they found themselves in circumstances that were less than desirable, like the rich and poor. That passage would address, hey, we're in circumstances we don't like, that aren't fair. Did I see another hand somewhere else? We're talking theme? Yes.
Active faith in times of trials.
All right, active faith in times of trust. Okay, all right.
It seems like a lot of it has to do with the shape of our humility in our faith. Not showing partiality.
Okay, aspects of humility, all right. What is the process? What are we trying to do to get to the theme? And I'm acknowledging, my attempts at theme in James, I'm not satisfied with. I don't think I've quite got it exactly. But what are we trying to do? How are we trying to get to the theme, the main idea? And I'm probably asking a specific question, a vague question, looking for a specific answer.
Doesn't it come later in the process?
It may come later in the process. It quite well could.
Not that it's a problem to think about now.
Right. What is the process? What process is going to lead to that? Your exegesis, all right.
The emphases that come out in
The emphases that come out, a thorough knowledge of the book. What the specific answer I'm looking for, it ties in all the things you've just said, is at some point, every section, we might call every paragraph, is going to support or contribute to that theme. I think that's more or less what we're going to do. This goes to your statement of the my brothers, all right? So we've suggested some themes. We'll circle back to it in a few minutes. But allow me to jump forward, I think. I mentioned these already. What else could it be? How do we arrive at theme? All right, so the structure and the organization. Here are a couple suggestions on organizing it. Let me start with one I have used. I drew this from a short commentary by Zane Hodges. And it's, I apologize, I cut and pasted, it's real small. His essential thesis is that the main outline of the book is found in verses 19 and 20 of chapter 1. And I found this fairly satisfactory, but not perfectly satisfactory. So allow me to briefly highlight it for you. You can consider it. Maybe that it's a secondary issue. He partially develops that it's that James was written in a certain form that was known, a certain epistolary form, and I forget the name of it off the top of my head. And the form included an introductory salutation. I'm sorry, it's so small. A salutation and quite often a lengthy introduction. So in this case, 18 verses. And then it presents the theme, and the theme or the statement of object, the statement of proposition is going to be the outline. And so if you will, there's a undercurrent in the salutation and the introduction of enduring trial. So there's certainly a trial-based thing that's going to happen. And out of those trials, in verses 19 and 20, if you see it there, you're to behave correctly. You're to learn to behave rightly, develop your character properly in trials in 3 ways or in 3 steps. And if you see verses 19 and 20, know this, my beloved brothers, let every person hear the 3 parts of the body of the text of the epistle is what his suggestion is. Let every man be, number 1, quick to hear, swift to hear. Number 2, slow to speak. And number 3, slow to wrath. And his suggestion is that becomes kind of the outline of the book. What I like about it is I like spotting outlines in the text that the author tells us. That's kind of nice. I feel a little more confident than my work. And so I think there may be something to it, but parts of it feel a little bit forced. But in other words, what he's saying is we need to learn to rightly act, to prove our character, to endure trials in being slow to speak. I'm sorry, swift to hear. And he develops it along that line. That goes through the end of chapter 2. Being swift to hear includes hearing and doing, essentially, hearing and doing the word. I think I could live with that. It kind of makes sense. The second one there in the text is being slow to speak. Well, chapter 3 would be his next section, which is on speech, right, on the tongue. That one fits pretty well. And then slow to wrath, it might fit that you turn the page into chapter 4, and that's, where do we get fights and quarrels among us and so on. That might fit. So I wonder if there is something to it, some kind of general thing. the reworking I've done here recently in prepping for this and so on is more along the lines of what you said of the my brothers. So I want to show you that for a minute, and we'll peruse that for a few moments. And what we have is this, and I haven't filled the whole thing in. You can do your own chart. The left column are the verse markers where things start, where the sections start. I didn't fill in the rest of it, but that's where they start. And everything there is my or my beloved brothers, unless I have mentioned it differently, all right? So if you fill in the second column, I didn't fill it in there because it's almost every time. I think there are 12 or 13 of them where he addresses them. And so just a side note, the title here is evocative. Evocative is just one of the parts of speech in the Greek language. We usually call it the case of direct address. And so if we're here, if I were to use evocative, and in Greek, of course, it is spelled differently usually. But if I were to use it here, I would say something like, men, stand up. And you don't have to right now. You can. The word men would be in the vocative. I'm addressing you fellas. The stand up would be the imperative, all right? What we have here is a very consistent pattern with only a handful of breaks that I'm still listing as paragraph breaks. But almost all of them are this vocative, my brothers or my beloved brothers, plus a command, an imperative. And so we'll read through them, but is my thing showing up here? So verse 2, my beloved brothers. Verse 16, my brothers, do or don't do this. Verse 19, same thing. Chapter 2, verse 1, same thing. If I didn't list it, then it's my brothers or my beloved brothers, do or don't do something, all right? And that seems to be the paragraph markers. This becomes the sections. This is pretty consistent. And by the way, the vocative, if you're able to search on that, or if you can read Greek and spot them, that quite often is a paragraph marker, a change of discourse marker. All right, so we have that. So for just a couple minutes, let me skim through these and show them to you. Chapter 1, verse 1 is just the introduction. James the apostle, James the servant to the dispersion. And in chapter 1, verse 2, we have the first opening section. And you find it there this way. The imperative, I'm reading ESV, it comes first in the ESV. Count it all joy, that's the command. Rejoice, count it all joy, my brothers, when you face various trials. Then he's going to develop that. And so he'll carry that through verse 15, and I'm going to say this, there's some sub-markers. I'm not getting into that. Alan probably will cover some of it in the next session. But that's a section or paragraph of this epistle. We come to verse 16, and there it says, imperative, command, do not be deceived. There's the command. Don't be deceived, my beloved brothers. All right, so we have it again. And we're going to keep going. Verse 19. I won't read all the way through here, but know this. There's the command. Know something. Know this, my beloved brothers. And then he explains something. He gives the instruction in full. And so it's going to continue all the way through there. 2:1, my brothers, show no partiality. Now the first break in pattern is the section that I'm working on, and one of my questions is, because I am taking, let you know ahead of time, chapter 2, verses 14 through 26 to be a unit. But you'll notice it does not start with an imperative, although it does have my brothers. All right, so there's a change. It changes to an interrogative, a question. What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? And so the my brothers without the imperative still stands, the vocative, my brothers, all right? And so this follows through. One of my questions, I just don't know the answer, is why the interrogatives? I mean, not to be redundant, but why the interrogatives? When almost all of them are imperatives. So I'm curious. I think there's something going on. If it's a further explanation, that's my initial thought, is it's another paragraph, but it is a sub-paragraph. It's explaining something. And actually, I missed one there. In 5:1, it's you rich. That's the vocative. It's not my brothers, it's you rich. And then I missed one, should be on the chart in 4:13. 4:13, come now, that's the command, come now. You who say, let's do this or that. So it's not the brothers, it's you who say. So there's some limitations on that. Let me pause there for a second. Again, maybe I should have filled the whole chart in. My point is that with verse 1 set aside as just the greeting, James to the dispersion, we have this very regular pattern that forms, I think it's 14 units, kind of paragraphs, that center around mostly the phrase brothers. When it's not that, it is a vocative. Again, that's the Greek term. That's the Greek term for a form of address. It's addressing someone directly. And most of them have an imperative, all right? So I think it divides the sections pretty well. Questions or observations? I know you had your hand up.
The interrogatives and the appearance of something different. James always seemed to me to be a letter written in response to something. It's not explicit like Paul when he writes to the Corinthians, where he's actually answering a letter.
Yeah.
But James is addressing specific things. And these may be those interactions
Yeah.
then with his instruction regarding the thing, and then his interaction about that instruction.
It could be, all right. Other observations on this structure? This, what I'm suggesting, by the way, especially for the younger guys learning to preach and developing your preaching and teaching, this, I would suggest, becomes very important, being able to identify your units, identify your paragraphs. And the skill to do that is different here than it is in the Psalms. You know, it's poetry. It's different than in the Gospels. You've got narrative, you've got long stories. But to be able to do this, because when you preach or teach it, I'm going to suggest that any of you have been here before, I've suggested this before, there's a lot of creativity in preaching. As long as you're true to the text, there's a lot of creativity. Your style's different than mine. Yours is probably creative and mine probably isn't. But I would find it troubling if on a regular basis you took the second half of paragraph 3 and the first half of paragraph 4, and that was your sermon. If that's what you do all the time, that kind of structure, it would seem strange to me. And I've used the illustration before. It would be very strange if you said, we're going to sing a song, open your hymn books to number 200, whatever that is, and we're going to sing the third line of verse 2, and then half of verse 3, and that will be our song today. I mean, you'd be like, what? Why are we doing that? For a lot of reasons. Another example like that would be if you were preaching through, say, Psalm 119. Y'all remember Psalm 119? One of the longest acrostic psalm with the Hebrew letters. Each 8-verse section starts with the succeeding Hebrew letter. Can you imagine if you did verse 5 as a message? You started at verse 5 and you went through verse 12 or something. You're picking half of one strophe and the second half of another strophe. It's very strange. I'm not saying you couldn't do it for some reason, but on a regular basis, it would be illogical. It would be strange. And so this is one of the issues, is to learn to find these paragraphs and to develop them logically and in order. Does that make sense? All right. Did I see another hand? Yeah, Rich.
How does that affect your ideas about the theme?
Yeah, that's where we're headed is, and that's what I'm saying is I'm not sure, and I haven't filled in this whole chart. If we were filling it in, you'd probably want to know what each subject line is. So you'd want to be able to, 1, 2 through 15 is dealing with joy and trials. I mean, the command is rejoice, my brothers, in every kind of trial. And 1:16 would be, my brothers, don't be deceived, because every good gift comes from God. That's the part I'm saying I don't feel like I've fully gotten a handle on. How to, in other words, each of those should contribute something, and when you begin to condense it and compile it, you're able to come up with this hopefully catchy but meaningful statement. The book of James teaches this. And that's the part, joy and trials of life, probably not bad. I think there's probably more to it, but not bad. Proven character was the other one. Proven character through testing, probably not bad. Have you guys come up with some other ones, even as we're talking here? Again, I'm introducing some things for you of what we're trying to accomplish. But other thoughts on the structure or the theme? Yes.
Yeah, I think all of that that's been said, obviously, but I think what's in there enough is that it's tempered with humility, because we see that. And then he brings out enough through the whole book about, the perils of putting our trust in riches. As you see in chapter 1, you see it a little bit in chapter 2. Chapter 4 speaks about making gain. And then chapter 5, we talked about, woe to the rich.
Yeah.
So I think it's almost, it takes me back to Deuteronomy when Moses is telling the Jews, when you go into the land, you praise God for what he gives to you. Otherwise, down the road, when he gets to chapter 8, he says, otherwise you're going to start saying, I've done this in my power.
Yeah.
So I think it's a little bit of, maybe down the road, as James is talking to these believers, is like, okay, now down the road, you're going to be going through trials, humble yourself before God, and maybe down the road, you might begin to have some, opportunities for some profits, some wealth. Beware.
Okay.
A little bit of that.
Yeah. I would certainly agree it's at least a sub-theme. As you referenced it, there is more there on wealth and the dangers than we get at first glance. And you're correct. And that again ties in with the fact that James seems to be pulling a lot from Jesus' teachings, because he spoke of that, and Old Testament, like you referenced in Deuteronomy. There probably is an allusion to that.
For a theme, one about Christians living with their brothers.
Christians living with their brothers. Maybe. Some of the trials seem to me to be external. So the chapter 5, again, tipping my hand, I personally think the woe to you, rich, is probably the one section that is not dealing with Christians. I think it's not dealing with Christians directly. They're in the background, but the direct address to the rich appears to me to probably be unsaved people. But others, whoever's covering that section may attack it differently. That's open for discussion. But yeah, possibly. All right. Other ideas on theme or structure? All right, we've got just a couple minutes before, we've got a few minutes. I think that was about the end of my one here. A couple of things have been suggested here. What I didn't have on the screen is the theology, where we're going to begin to dig in. Let me make a few comments and I'll wrap it up here, and we'll take a break for just a few minutes. But the theology of James is going to come in if you conclude that all or almost every paragraph is addressed to brothers, and if the brothers in the address are Christian brothers, then there's quite a bit of this is where some of the heat is generated in this discussion of faith without works and so on. And so we'll be discussing that throughout the book. We'll certainly hit it when we get to my section again in chapter 2 tomorrow. But that opens the door for some spirited discussion, I think, on some things along that line. All right, I've actually finished a little bit early this evening, so we can probably take a break for a few minutes unless there are any other questions or observations. Why don't we...